In the merciless plains of Nebraska Territory, 1874, a weathered farmer works his land as dust devils dance across the horizon. His calloused hands tell a story of honest labor, but the scars beneath his shirt whisper darker tales. The bandits, watching from the distant ridgeline, don't realize that stealing from Mason Wells will be the last mistake they ever make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late summer sun beat down on Mason's wheat fields, turning the stalks into waves of gold that rippled in the hot prairie wind. At 53, his face was lined like old leather, but his movements remained precise as he repaired the irrigation channel that kept his crops alive through the brutal drought. 10 years of farming had taught him patience, though anyone watching closely might notice how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit that had nothing to do with agriculture. The barn behind him stood as a testament to careful planning. Every board personally selected, every nail driven with purpose. Most visitors saw only a simple structure, but they missed the subtle details. Sightlines carefully maintained in every direction, walls thick enough to stop more than just the winter wind, and a root cellar whose depth seemed excessive for storing vegetables. Mason paused his work, listening as the afternoon birds suddenly went silent. His daughter Rachel emerged from the farmhouse, her long brown hair tied back as she carried a water pitcher toward him. At 22, she had her mother's grace, but carried herself with the alertness Mason had insisted upon since childhood. Without looking up, he called out softly, "Take it back inside, Rachel." She hesitated only a moment before reversing course, understanding the tension in her father's voice. Mason returned to his work, his movements deliberately casual as he tracked the dust cloud approaching from the east. Through years of experience, he could read the signs. Multiple riders, moving fast and confident, the kind of men who believed the frontier belonged to those bold enough to take it. The Wells farm stood out as an oasis in the drought-stricken territory, while other properties withered. Mason's crops thrived thanks to innovative irrigation techniques he'd learned from local tribes. He'd freely shared his knowledge with neighbors, earning a reputation for fairness that attracted both respect and envy. But it wasn't just his farming success that set him apart. There was something in his bearing, in the way he moved, that made more observant visitors uneasy, like a hunting knife wrapped in soft cloth. Inside the farmhouse, Rachel watched through a gap in the shutters as the riders emerged from the heat haze. 6 men, their horses and gear showing the wear of hard travel, but their weapons gleaming with recent care. Their leader sat his mount with military bearing, though his uniform days were clearly long past. Even at this distance, the silver-handled Remington at his hip caught the sunlight like a warning. Mason continued working, his body relaxed but his mind calculating distances, angles, options. The root cellar beneath the barn held more than just winter stores, a fact only he and Rachel knew. 10 years of peace had taught him the value of preparation, but 20 years before that had taught him the cost of hesitation. The riders approached in a loose formation that spoke of experience. Their leader, a man whose face bore the marks of countless bar fights, pulled up 20 yards from where Mason worked. "That's some mighty fine-looking wheat you got there, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Especially considering how dry it's been." Mason straightened slowly, leaning on his shovel like any aging farmer might. "The good Lord provides," he answered simply, though his weight was balanced perfectly on the balls of his feet. He recognized the leader's type, men who'd learned enough discipline to be dangerous, but not enough wisdom to be anything else. "Name's Curtis Blackwood," the leader announced, touching the brim of his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My boys and I, we represent certain business interests. Been noticing how some farms are doing better than others in these hard times. Seems to us that ain't exactly fair." A younger rider with a patchy beard spat tobacco juice into the irrigation channel. "Way we see it, those that prosper ought to share their good fortune." His hand rested casually on his holstered revolver, but Mason noted how the man's trigger finger twitched, a tell that spoke of nervousness masked by bravado. Mason's eyes flickered briefly to the contaminated water channel, the only sign of emotion he'd shown. "Might want to watch where you spit, son. Man's labor deserves respect." The words were mild, but something in his tone made several of. The riders shift uneasily in their saddles. Blackwood dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously in the afternoon quiet. Through the window, Rachel kept her father's rifle trained on the group, though she knew from long experience that Mason preferred to handle trouble his own way. She'd seen that way only once, 5 years ago, when rustlers had tried to raid their cattle. The memory still visited her dreams sometimes. "Let's be civilized about this," Blackwood continued, pacing slowly as his men spread out in a practiced pattern. "Way we see it, you've got 2 choices. You can contribute to our community fund, regular-like, or we can have ourselves a discussion about property rights that might get messy." Mason's weathered face remained impassive, but his mind was already mapping the scene, noting how the youngest rider's horse was favoring its left foreleg, how the man with the eye patch carried his weight too far forward, small details that most would miss, but that experience had taught him could mean the difference between life and death. "Been working this land for 10 years, Mason replied, his voice carrying across the afternoon stillness. "Shared water rights with anyone who asked. Never turn away a neighbor in need." He paused, something hardening in his eyes. "But that ain't what this is about, is it?" Blackwood's friendly manner cracked slightly, revealing the predator beneath. "Times are changing, old man. Either change with them or get plowed under. Your choice." He gestured, and one of his men dismounted, carrying a torch toward the wheat. "You field?" Mason hadn't moved, but somehow he seemed to occupy more space than before, as if his stillness was more threatening than any motion could be. "That crop ain't yours to burn." The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like a steel blade, making the man with the torch hesitate. Rachel's grip tightened on the rifle as she watched the scene unfold. She'd seen her father handle trouble before, but something felt different this time. These men weren't simple bandits. Their organization, their tactics spoke of military experience gone bad. Through the window, she could see Mason's hands hanging loose at his sides, nowhere near the tool belt that she knew concealed more than farming implements. Blackwood drew his Remington with practiced smoothness, though he pointed it at the ground rather than Mason. "Maybe we need to demonstrate how serious we are about our business arrangement." His eyes shifted to the farmhouse. "That's a mighty fine daughter you got there. Shame if something were to happen to her future prospects." What happened next seemed to defy natural law. Mason's movement was like lightning contained in human form, his hands sweeping back the workshirt to reveal a custom Colt that seemed to materialize in his grip. Before Blackwood could track the motion, his prized Remington went spinning into the dust, a precise shot having struck its hammer. The gang stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what their eyes had witnessed. "That was a warning," Mason said, his voice carrying across the suddenly still afternoon. "I've got 5 rounds left, 6 riders, simple arithmetic." His tone hadn't changed, but now it carried echoes of something that made even Blackwood's battle hardened. When pale slightly, the younger rider's hand twitched toward his gun, but Mason's eyes locked onto him. "Son, I've killed better men than you before breakfast. Back when I was actually old." Blackwood's face had gone white, recognition finally dawning. They said you died in the war." "They said a lot of things," Mason cut him off. "Most of them are wrong." The afternoon wind carried the scent of gun smoke and fear across the wheat field as a decade of carefully maintained peace hung in the balance. Blackwood raised his hands, slowly, rage warring with survival instinct on his scarred face. Behind him, his men remained motionless, their confident demeanor shattered by the sudden shift in power. The man holding the torch had gone pale, the flame trembling in his unsteady grip. "Never figured I'd see you again," Blackwood managed, his voice struggling for control. "Not after Richmond." "Drop it," Mason ordered the torchbearer, deliberately ignoring Blackwood's reference to the past. The man complied instantly, extinguishing the flame in the dirt. Rachel watched from the house as her father maintained his lethal focus, noting how he kept the gang leader centered while his peripheral vision tracked every subtle movement from the others. Through the window, she caught glimpses of another story unfolding in the subtle reactions of Blackwood's men. The older ones, those who carried themselves like former soldiers, showed a recognition that went beyond simple fear. They knew exactly who they were facing. The younger ones just looked confused, their worldview crumbling as they watched their invincible leader rendered helpless by a simple farmer. "Your reputation," Blackwood started again, but Mason cut him off. "Isn't what matters right now." His voice remained steady, almost gentle, but carried an edge that made the horses stamp nervously. "What matters is the choice you're about to make. You can ride away, spread the word that Mason Wells Farm is off limits, or you can find out if I'm still as fast as the stories say." A tense moment passed as Blackwood weighed his options. His eyes darted to his fallen Remington, calculating odds that Mason's unwavering gaze told him would end badly. Finally, the gang leader gave a sharp nod. "Mount up," he ordered his men, his voice tight with suppressed fury. As they turned their horses, Blackwood couldn't resist one final attempt to salvage his pride. "This ain't over, Wells. Territory's changing. Man alone can't stand against what's coming." "Good thing I'm not alone then." Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes as he nodded toward the farmhouse. The setting sun glinted off Rachel's rifle barrel, revealing that the gang had been in her sights the entire time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The riders departed in a cloud of wounded pride and dust, though Mason maintained his ready stance until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he holster the Colt with the same fluid grace that had drawn it, the movement so natural it seemed like part of his farming routine. Rachel emerged from the house, rifle still ready. "They'll be back," she said quietly, studying the dust cloud that marked the gang's retreat. Mason nodded, checking the contaminated irrigation channel. "With more men," he agreed, already calculating what preparations would be needed. "Time to send word to Sheriff Patterson." He turned to his daughter, seeing the question in her eyes. "And time you knew the whole truth about Richmond." The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the wheat fields in shades of blood and gold. Mason Wells stood watching the darkening sky, knowing that his carefully constructed peace had just been shattered. The past he'd tried to bury had surfaced like a hungry ghost, and now his most precious secrets would have to be revealed. But as he felt the familiar weight of the Colt against his hip, he realized that perhaps some ghosts needed to rise, especially when the living threatened everything he'd built. Inside the farmhouse, Rachel began preparing their evening meal, her movements precise and controlled, like her father had taught her. Through the window, she watched him examine the perimeter of their property with the eyes of someone who had spent years learning how to survive. She had always known there was more to him than the simple farmer he pretended to be. Now, as autumn's early shadows crept across their land, she would finally learn what dark skills lay beneath his peaceful exterior, skills that might be the only thing standing between their family and the storm that was surely coming. 20 miles east of Mason Wells's farm, in a decrepit hunting cabin nestled among ancient cottonwoods, Curtis Blackwood's fury erupted. The silver-handled Remington, retrieved from the dust of his humiliation, slammed against the rough-hewn wall. His men watched warily as their leader's practiced control crumbled. 10 years, Blackwood snarled, pacing the cabin's cramped interior. 10 years building our operation, and you're telling me none of you knew? None of you recognized the name Wells? His cold eyes fixed on Jackson Miller, his second-in-command and longest-serving lieutenant. Miller, a graying man whose Confederate cavalry uniform had long since been replaced by civilian garb, shifted uncomfortably. That wasn't his name back then, Curtis. Back in Richmond, during the siege, they called him the Ghost. Blackwood cut him off. The Union Army's favorite nightmare. He ran a finger along the scar that divided his left cheek. A souvenir. From a battlefield he'd tried to forget. Should have known. The way he moved, those eyes. Ain't many men left alive who can draw that fast. The younger members of the gang exchanged confused glances. Tommy Hayes, the one who'd spat in Wells. Irrigation Channel finally spoke up. What's the big deal? He's just one old farmer. We come back with enough men. The laugh that burst from Blackwood's throat held no humor. Just a farmer? Boy, that farmer once held off an entire Confederate regiment single-handedly. 2 hours in the rain, 43 confirmed kills. He grabbed Tommy by the collar, forcing the young man to meet his gaze. You know why they called him the Ghost? Because if he wanted you dead, you never saw him coming. Just found your sentries with their throats cut, your ammunition mysteriously. Exploded, your supplies gone. He was a shadow that killed and vanished. That was war, Miller interjected, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Different times, different rules. Different rules. Blackwood released Tommy and turned to face his old comrade. You really think a man like that just forgets? Just turns into a peaceful farmer? He retrieved a bottle of whiskey from his saddlebag, taking a long pull before continuing. No, he's been preparing. You saw that farm, everything positioned just so, clear lines of sight in every direction. He's been ready for trouble all along. The cabin fell silent as the implications sank in. The only sound was the evening wind rustling through the cottonwoods and the distant cry of a hunting hawk. Finally, Eddie Cross, their scout, spoke from his position by the window. We could still take him. Man's got to sleep sometime. Blackwood's expression shifted, the rage giving way to something more calculating. No, we do this smart. He spread a crude map across the cabin's only table. This territory's changing. Railroads coming through 50 miles south. Armies pulling back to deal with uprisings near Fort Laramie. Perfect time for men like us to establish new rules. His finger traced a path across the map. Wells Farm sits right in the middle of everything. His water rights, his influence with the local tribes. He's got power he doesn't even realize. What about the girl? Tommy asked, still rubbing his collar where Blackwood had grabbed him. His daughter? Rachel, Miller supplied. Saw her watching from the house. Got her mother's look about her. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You knew his wife? Miller nodded slowly. Sarah Montgomery, best shot in Virginia until Wells came along. They met during the Petersburg campaign when she was running intelligence for the Union. He paused. Something, like regret, crossing his weathered features. She died in childbirth, but the daughter survived. Then we know his weakness, Blackwood said, but Miller shook his head. Man like Wells, his love for his daughter won't make him weak. It'll make him more dangerous than you can imagine. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Liam Reeves, their newest recruit, who'd been keeping watch outside. The young man's face was flushed with excitement. Riders coming, he reported. 4 of them from the south. Leading pack horses are loaded heavily. Blackwood moved to the window, his expression brightening as he recognized the approaching group. Well now, it looks like the Lord's sending us exactly what we need. He turned to his men, authority returning to his voice. Clean this place. Our guests deserve a proper welcome. The riders who arrived minutes later were a hard-looking bunch, led by a man whose black duster and wide-brimmed hat couldn't quite hide the military bearing beneath. Major James Harrison had once commanded A unit of Union Army raiders, men who specialized in the kind of operations that never made it into official reports. After the war, he'd turned those skills to more profitable ventures. Curtis, Harrison dismounted smoothly, though his men remained in their saddles, hands never far from their weapons. Your message said you had a proposition for us. Must be important to call us all the way up from Kansas. Blackwood gestured toward the cabin. Major, you have no idea. Boys, help them unload those horses. Something tells me we're about to do some serious business. Inside, Harrison surveyed the crude map while Blackwood explained the situation. The Major's face remained impassive until Wells's name was mentioned. Then a spark of recognition lit his cold eyes. Mason Wells, Harrison mused, rolling the name across his tongue like he was tasting it. Now there's a ghost I never thought I'd hear about again. He looked up at Blackwood. You're certain? Saw him with my own eyes, still fast as ever. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Last time I encountered him was 65, just after Richmond fell. He'd been hunting deserters who were preying on civilian refugees. Found them all, every last one. Their bodies sent a message that even the most hardened raiders understood. What kind of man do you want controlling the water rights when the railroad comes through? Blackwood pressed. Man who can turn half the territory against us with a few words to his Indian friends? The Major's laugh was soft, but held no warmth. Curtis, my friend, you're thinking too small. Wells isn't just an obstacle, he's an opportunity. He reached for one of the pack horse's saddlebags, retrieving a wooden case. Inside, nestled in padded compartments, lay several brass and steel devices that gleamed in the lantern light. Latest army equipment, Harrison explained, assembling one of the devices with practiced ease. Telescopic sight, brass fittings, precision-machined parts. Lets a decent shot hit a target at ranges that would make Wells' old Colt useless. He smiled thinly. And I brought enough for everyone. Blackwood studied the weapon appreciatively, but Miller spoke up from his corner. Won't matter how far away we are if he sees us coming. Man's got eyes like a hawk and knows every approach to that farm. Then we change the rules of engagement, Harrison replied. Wells is dangerous because he controls the battlefield, so we take that control away. He pulled another item from the saddlebags, a detailed survey map of the territory, far more precise than Blackwood's crude drawing. The railroad company had their engineers through here last spring. Every water source, every elevation, every possible defensible position. It's all right here. The cabin grew quiet as Harrison's men brought in more equipment, explosives, signal mirrors, even carrier pigeons for long-range communication. This wasn't going to be a simple raid, it was going to be a military operation. How many men can you bring? Blackwood asked, already calculating possibilities. 20 more, 2 days' ride south, Harrison answered. All veterans, all equipped with the new rifles. But more importantly, he produced a letter bearing an official seal. We have friends in high places. In 3 weeks, the army patrol that normally passes through this territory will be conveniently reassigned. Wells won't be getting any help. And from that quarter, Miller watched the preparations with growing unease. He'd seen that look in Harrison's eyes before, back during the war, the look of a man who saw people as pieces on a chessboard, to be sacrificed or saved according to strategic necessity. "Oh, what about the town?" Tommy asked. "Wells has got friends there." Harrison's smile widened slightly. "That's where you local boys come in. Over the next few weeks, you'll create just enough trouble to keep the sheriff and his deputies occupied. Nothing too serious, just enough to stretch their resources thin. When the time comes, Wells will find himself very much alone." Blackwood nodded approvingly, but Miller noticed how Harrison's men had positioned themselves around the cabin's interior, maintaining clear fields of fire toward everyone present. This wasn't just an alliance. It was a subtle takeover. The Major was assuming command, and Blackwood either didn't notice or didn't care. As night fell over the cabin, plans were laid with military precision. Harrison's experience in special operations merged with Blackwood's local knowledge, creating a strategy that would unfold over weeks rather than days. They weren't just going after Wells, they were going to dismantle everything he'd built, piece by piece. Miller excused himself to take the first watch, grateful for the chance to escape the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. In the darkness, he found himself remembering other nights, other campaigns, where men planned complex operations against seemingly insurmountable opponents. But something felt different this time. Standing beneath the cottonwoods, listening to the wind and watching the stars wheel overhead, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that they were all underestimating Mason Wells. The man he'd known during the war wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was someone who understood the darkness in men's souls, who knew how to use their own ambitions and fears against them. The veteran cavalryman touched the faded Confederate stripe on his jacket, remembering battlefields where the ghost's reputation had grown. Harrison might have new weapons and detailed maps, but Miller suspected that wouldn't be enough, because the most dangerous thing about Mason Wells wasn't his speed with a gun or his tactical brilliance. It was his patience, his ability to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. As midnight approached, Miller watched Harrison's men establishing guard positions with professional efficiency. They were good, he had to admit. Probably the best team of gunmen he'd seen since the war. But as he recalled the look in Wells's eyes when Blackwood had threatened his daughter, Miller wondered if even that would be enough to overcome a father's determination to protect what he loved. A soft whistle drew Miller's attention to the tree. "Line!" One of Harrison's men, a shadow among shadows, signaled the arrival of another rider. The newcomer's approach had been silent, no creaking saddle, no jingling spurs, marking him as someone who understood the value of stealth. The rider dismounted smoothly, leading his horse through the darkness with practiced ease. Even before he stepped into the cabin's lamplight, Miller recognized the distinctive gait of Marcus Lynch, the territory's most notorious tracker. The man's scarred face and mismatched eyes gave him a fearsome appearance, but it was his reputation that made hardened gunmen step aside. Harrison greeted Lynch with unexpected familiarity. "Report." "Town's exactly as you described." Lynch's voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle. "Sheriff Patterson's got 3 deputies, all green. Bank sends its shipments south every second. Tuesday, the telegraph office closes at sunset." He produced a small notebook, its pages filled with precise drawings. "And I found something interesting about Wells Farm." The tracker's detailed sketches revealed aspects of the property that even Miller, with his frequent visits, hadn't noticed. The angle of fence posts that could serve as cover, the slight rise of land that provided a clear view of approaching riders, the carefully maintained gaps in the tree line, all pointing to a defensive mindset that went far beyond normal frontier. "Precautions. Man's been planning for trouble," Blackwood observed, but Lynch shook his head. "Not planning, teaching." He pointed to smaller details in his drawings. "See these marks on the barn door? Height measurements, probably for his daughter. And here, behind the house, shooting positions arranged for someone smaller with a different sightline. He's been training her, preparing her to defend the place alongside him." Harrison absorbed this information with professional interest. Like father, like daughter, Sarah Montgomery's girl would have to be special. He turned to Blackwood. "Changes nothing. In fact, it makes our job easier. Wells will be distracted trying to protect her, making him more predictable." Miller watched Lynch carefully roll up his drawings, noting how the tracker's expression remained carefully neutral. The man's reputation spoke of someone who could read sign like others read books, who could track a ghost across bare rock. But there was something else in his manner, a reluctance that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. "One more thing," Lynch added, almost hesitantly. "Found tracks near the North Creek. Apache, maybe 4 or 5 warriors. They're watching the farm but not threatening it. More like protecting it." This news sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Apache allegiance could shift the balance of power significantly. Harrison, however, seemed almost pleased. "Perfect," the major declared. "We'll use that. Blackwood, your men start spreading rumors about Indian raids. Lynch plants some evidence. Burned wagons, broken arrows, whatever sells the story. When Wells starts investigating, he'll be looking in the wrong direction." As the night deepened, more details of Harrison's plan emerged. It wasn't just about eliminating one dangerous man. It was about establishing control over the entire territory. Wells's farm was just the first step in a larger strategy that would use the coming railroad to build an empire of protection rackets and water rights control. Miller excused himself again, needing air that wasn't thick with plots and ambition. Outside, he found Lynch already mounted, preparing to depart. "You knew him, didn't you?" Miller asked quietly. "During the war?" Lynch's mismatched eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. "Everyone knew the ghost," he replied carefully. "Few ever saw him. Fewer lived to tell about it." He adjusted his saddle, then added, "Harrison's planning this like a military operation. That's a mistake." "Why?" "Because Wells isn't a soldier anymore. He's a father protecting his child. That makes him more dangerous than any ghost." With that cryptic observation, Lynch melted into the darkness, leaving Miller to contemplate the growing complexity of their situation. Dawn was approaching when Harrison finally finished outlining his complete strategy. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. The Major's men would establish hidden positions over the next few weeks, gradually tightening a noose around Wells' farm, while Blackwood's gang created diversions throughout the territory. But as Miller watched the eastern sky brighten, he remembered something his old cavalry commander used to say: "The most dangerous enemy isn't the one who fights hardest, but the one who watches longest." Wells had spent 10 years building his quiet life, establishing connections, earning trust. That kind of patience spoke of a man who knew how to play a long game. The question wasn't whether Harrison's plan would work. It was whether they'd survive learning why a legendary ghost had chosen to become a farmer in the first place. 3 days after Blackwood's retreat, the morning stillness at Wells' farm was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Rachel, tending to the kitchen garden, noticed how her father's hand moved casually toward his concealed Colt before recognizing Sheriff Patterson's distinctive bay mare. The sheriff's normally affable expression was creased with worry as he dismounted. At 48, Daniel Patterson had served the territory for 15 years, earning respect through fairness rather than force. Now, as he approached Mason, his manner suggested news that couldn't wait. "Heard about your visitors," Patterson said without preamble. "Word travels fast out here." Mason continued repairing a broken fence post, his movements unhurried. "Suppose it does." 3 homesteads have been hit in the past 2 days. Nothing stolen, just property damage. Fences cut, wells contaminated. The sheriff studied Mason's reaction carefully. "Happening in a circle, working their way toward town. Your place sits right in the middle of it all." Rachel brought water for the sheriff's horse, using the task to stay within earshot. She noticed how her father's rhythm with the fence post never faltered, though his eyes had taken on that distant look she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he was calculating possibilities. "Apache raids?" Mason asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Patterson shook his head. "Signs were planted. Too obvious. Someone wants us looking the wrong way." He lowered his voice. "Town council's meeting tonight. Railroad survey crew arrived yesterday talking about water rights and property values. Timing seems awful convenient." Before Mason could respond, movement on the western ridge caught their attention. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the morning sun. Even at this distance, there was something distinctive about his posture, a military bearing that set him apart from typical travelers. Major James Harrison, Patterson supplied, his voice tight. Supposedly representing Eastern investors. Been asking questions about local properties, especially ones with good water access. Mason straightened, studying the approaching rider with eyes that missed nothing. Know him? By reputation. Led a special unit during the war. These days he works for whoever pays best. The sheriff mounted his horse. Watch yourself, Mason. Things are changing faster than I can track. As Patterson rode away, Harrison drew closer. Rachel retreated to the house, but not before catching the subtle signal from her father. 3 fingers pressed against his leg, their private code for taking up a covered firing position. She moved unhurriedly, knowing that sometimes the best defense was letting your opponent think they had the advantage. Harrison stopped 30 yards out, removing his hat in a gesture of exaggerated courtesy. His grey-streaked hair and weathered features spoke of hard years, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. "Mr. Wells," he called out, "hope I'm not interrupting your morning." Mason's response was measured, giving nothing away. "Long ride from town. Your horse could use some water." "Thoughtful of you." Harrison dismounted smoothly, leading his mount toward the water trough. His every movement was precise, calculated. A soldier's economy of motion that hadn't faded with time. "Beautiful property you've developed here. Especially impressive given the drought conditions." "God's been good to us," Mason replied, the same answer he gave everyone who commented on his farm's success. But Harrison's slight smile suggested he heard the steel beneath the humility. "Yes, he has, though in my experience, God helps those who help themselves." Harrison's hand rested casually on his saddle horn, near a holstered Remington that matched the one he'd given Blackwood. "Your irrigation methods, for instance. Very innovative. Army engineers could learn something from your design." The implied threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Mason set down his fence-mending tools, his movements deliberately slow. "Sounds like you've done some studying. I always research potential investments thoroughly." Harrison produced a folded document from his coat. "I represent certain interests back east. They've authorized me to make you a very generous offer for this property." Mason didn't even glance at the paper. "Not interested. You haven't heard. The terms." Harrison's voice remained pleasant, but something cold crept into his eyes. "Times are changing, Mr. Wells. Railroads coming, territories growing. Man needs friends in high places to protect what's his, or just needs to be left alone." Mason's tone carried the same quiet authority that had made Blackwood's men hesitate. Harrison's smile widened slightly. "Interesting choice of words. Being left alone is a privilege these days, not a right, especially for men with complicated histories." The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. Rachel, watching through her rifle sight, saw how both men had shifted their weight almost imperceptibly. Seasoned fighters, recognizing the signs of imminent violence. "That's quite a scar on Curtis Blackwood's sporting career," Harrison continued conversationally. "Souvenir from Richmond," he says. "Funny thing about war wounds, they have a way of festering even years later. Man never knows when old injuries might flare up again." Mason's response was quiet but carried clearly in the morning air. "Wounds work both ways, Major. Some men learn from them, others just keep picking at scabs until they bleed again." Harrison's laugh held no humor. "Philosophy from the ghost of Richmond. Now I've heard everything." He remounted with fluid grace, though his eyes never left Mason. "Consider my offer. Railroad commission's reviewing water rights next month. Be a shame if someone raised questions about your claims' legitimacy." As Harrison rode away, Rachel emerged from her position, rifle still ready. "He knows about Richmond," she said softly. "About who you were." Mason nodded, watching the Major's retreating form. "More than that. He knows what's coming. Man like Harrison doesn't show his hand unless he's already got the game rigged." Inside the house, Mason retrieved a battered wooden box from beneath a floorboard. Rachel had seen it only once before, when rustlers had threatened their cattle. Now, as her father opened it, she understood why he'd kept it hidden. The box contained papers, military orders, commendation letters, and a single photograph showing a younger Mason Wells standing among a group of grim-faced men. Their uniforms bore no rank insignia, no unit patches. They were ghosts in every sense. "Your mother took that," Mason said quietly, touching the photographer's worn edge. "Petersburg, 64, Special Operations Unit. Harrison commanded the Confederate equivalent, 2 groups of shadows hunting each other through the war's darkest corners." Rachel studied the image, seeing her father through new eyes. The scar on his neck, that was Harrison? Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the old wound. "Last time we met, raid went bad. He lost half his men. I lost something else." His eyes grew distant. "War changes people, Rachel. Some men come home and build something new. Others—" He gestured toward the horizon where Harrison had disappeared. "Others just find new battlefields." The day progressed with deceptive normalcy, but Rachel noticed how her father checked their defensive preparations with extra care. The rifle ports hidden in the barn walls, the emergency supplies cached in the root cellar, the carefully maintained escape routes, all took on new significance. As evening approached, more riders appeared on the distant ridges. They made no hostile moves, but their presence sent a clear message. Harrison was establishing a perimeter, showing that he could watch the farm from any direction. "Testing our patience," Mason observed, though his voice held no concern. "Trying to make us jumpy, waste energy watching shadows." Rachel helped him check the livestock, securing them for the night. "What do we do?" "Nothing." Mason's smile held a predator's certainty. "Let them watch, let them think they're in control. Man like Harrison, his biggest weakness is believing he's the smartest person in the fight." A shot rang out just after sunset. A single rifle crack that shattered a window in the upper floor. Rachel dropped instinctively to cover, but Mason remained standing, seemingly unconcerned. "Warning shot," he explained, "from the north ridge about 800 yards. New rifle with a telescopic sight. Harrison's showing off his toys." More shots followed throughout the night, none meant to hit, but all precisely aimed to keep them on edge. It was psychological warfare, the kind that Harrison had perfected during the war. But if he expected Mason Wells to crack under pressure, he'd forgotten the most important lesson of their shared past. You couldn't break a ghost with fear, you couldn't terrorize a shadow, and you couldn't threaten a father who'd spent 10 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight. As dawn approached, Rachel found her father in the barn, methodically checking their weapons. The old Colt rode on his hip, but other tools of war had emerged from hidden caches, a Spencer carbine, a Sharps rifle, even a set of throwing knives that spoke of skills far removed from farming. "Time you knew everything," Mason said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "About Richmond, about your mother, about why we really chose this place." He handed her a leather-bound journal. "Sarah, your mother, she kept records, names, dates, connections, the kind of information that powerful men would kill to keep buried." Rachel opened the journal, recognizing her mother's precise handwriting. "This is why Harrison's really here, isn't it? Not just the water rights or the railroad." Mason nodded grimly. "Your mother was more than just a Union intelligence officer. She uncovered something bigger, a conspiracy involving military contracts. Land grabs, profits built on blood. Harrison was part of it, still is from the looks of things." The first light of morning revealed fresh tracks around the farm. Harrison's men had probed their defenses during the night, testing response times and looking for weaknesses. But they'd found nothing that Mason hadn't wanted them to find. "War taught me one thing," Mason said, watching the sun rise over their threatened home. Victory doesn't always go to the strongest or the fastest. Sometimes it goes to the one who's willing to wait the longest, to let the enemy think they're winning, until it's too late. Rachel understood then why her father had chosen this land, why he'd spent years preparing it like a general, preparing a battlefield. This wasn't just a farm. It was a fortress, designed by a man who knew that some wars don't end when the armies go home. And as she watched Harrison's men establish their positions on the distant ridges, Rachel Wells realized that her father's patient preparation was about to be tested in ways that would reshape not just their lives, but the future of the entire territory. The morning brought a new visitor, one whose appearance sent Mason's hands instinctively to his weapons. Marcus Lynch materialized from the early mist like an apparition, his mismatched eyes scanning the farm's defenses with professional appreciation. He carried no visible weapons, though both Wells knew that meant nothing with a man of his reputation. Mighty. "Fine operation you've built here," Lynch observed, his soft voice carrying across the yard. "Reminds me of another place, a long time back. Petersburg, wasn't it?" Mason's response was measured. "Long way from Petersburg, Mr. Lynch." "Indeed it is." The tracker's scarred face creased in what might have been a smile. "Harrison's got 32. Men in position. 8 with new Whitworth rifles, rest with standard army issue. They're setting up signal stations on 3 ridges, planning to coordinate their movements." He paused, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Course, that's what he wants you to see." Rachel watched the exchange from her position near the barn, noting how neither man made any unnecessary movements. They were like 2 wolves circling, testing the air. "Why are you here, Marcus?" Mason finally asked. "Man saves your life. He deserves fair warning when trouble's coming." Lynch's gaze swept the horizon. "Harrison's planning something for tonight. New moon, good cover, but that's not the real threat." "The Railroad Commission." Lynch nodded. "They're not just reviewing water rights, they're rewriting the whole territory's future. Harrison's got men placed in every office, every council. By the time most folks realize what's happening, it'll be too late." Mason studied the tracker carefully. "You're working for him." "I'm paid to track. What folks do with the information, that's their business." Lynch adjusted his hat against the rising sun. "But some debts run deeper than money. Petersburg taught me that." The tracker produced a folded paper from his coat. "Harrison's real plan. Thought you should see it." He placed the document on a fence post and backed away slowly. "I was never. Here, Mason. Way I figure it, that makes us even for Petersburg." After Lynch vanished into the morning haze, Mason retrieved the paper. His expression hardened as he read, then handed it to Rachel. The document detailed not just military positions, but political machinations, a complex web of corruption that stretched from local councils all the way to Washington. "Harrison's building an empire," Rachel said quietly, "using the railroad as cover, and your mother's journal proves it all." Mason checked his Colt with practiced efficiency. "That's why he can't just kill us. He needs to discredit us first, make anything we say sound like the ravings of desperate homesteaders fighting progress." The day grew hotter as they strengthened their defenses, but Rachel noticed something had changed in her father's demeanor. The passive waiting was over. Now each movement had purpose, each preparation aimed at a specific goal. By late afternoon, more riders appeared on the horizon. Not Harrison's men this time, but local farmers. Word had spread about the Wells Farm's resistance, and families who'd faced similar threats came seeking guidance. Mason met them in the yard, his manner calm but authoritative. Among them was young Billy Thompson, whose family's well had been poisoned 3 days ago. The boy's father had once served under Mason in the war, though Billy didn't know that history. "Ain't right," Billy's father declared, his face weathered by the sun and worry. "Railroad men come in, start talking about progress and development, but all we see is threats and destruction. The sheriff can't help. He's stretched too thin dealing with Indian raids that don't feel right. Mason listened as each farmer shared similar stories. Harrison's plan was larger than anyone had realized. The railroad wouldn't just change the territory's future. It would determine who had the power to shape that future. As the group discussed strategies for mutual defense, a shot rang out from the North Ridge. The farmers scattered for cover, but Mason remained standing, watching through his spyglass as a rider departed Harrison's observation post at full gallop. "They're getting nervous," he observed, "seeing us organize, share information, not part of their plan." Rachel helped the farmers find safe paths home, noting how each one left with renewed determination. Her father hadn't just given them tactical advice. He'd given them hope, shown them they weren't alone in the fight. As evening approached, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The weather would provide perfect cover for Harrison's planned night operation, but Mason showed no concern. If anything, he seemed almost pleased by the approaching darkness. "Your mother used to say something," he told Rachel as they made final preparations. "Said the best trap isn't the one that kills your enemy, it's the one that makes him defeat himself." Rachel studied the journal she'd been reading, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why we're letting them come. Why are we showing just enough strength to make them commit fully?" Mason smiled, the expression holding echoes of the ghost he'd once been. "Harrison thinks he's fighting a war. I think his fancy rifles and military tactics give him the advantage. He checked the priming on his Colt one final time, but he's forgotten the most important lesson from Richmond." "What's that?" "War's just killing, but justice." Mason's eyes held the certainty of a man who'd spent 10 years preparing for this moment. Justice is about making sure the right people face the consequences of their actions. The storm broke just after sunset, thunder masking the movement of horses and men. But in the darkness of the Wells farm, father and daughter waited with the patience of people who knew that sometimes victory comes not from fighting the hardest, but from understanding when to let your enemy think they're winning. Harrison's night attack was coming, but it wasn't the real threat. The true battle wouldn't be fought with guns and tactics, but with evidence and testimony. And in that fight, the ghost of Petersburg had already prepared a battlefield that his enemies wouldn't even see until it was too late. The storm that broke over the Wells farm brought more than just rain and darkness. As midnight approached, Rachel monitored the western approach from her hidden position in the barn's hayloft, counting lightning flashes and the seconds until thunder followed. The storm was moving fast, but something else was moving with it. A flash of lightning revealed shadowy figures advancing through the rain, using the weather's cover to probe their defenses. These weren't Harrison's trained men. The movement patterns were all wrong. Local muscle, probably Blackwood's gang, being used as cannon fodder to test their response. Mason's voice carried softly through the speaking tube they'd installed between the barn and house. "Count? 8, maybe 10, Rachel replied, adjusting her grip on the Sharp's rifle. "Moving sloppy. Don't think they know about the south pasture. Modifications." Her father's quiet laugh held no humor. "Harrison's keeping his best men in reserve, watching to see how we handle the first wave." The gang's approach revealed their inexperience. They'd spotted the obvious defensive positions, the reinforced windows, the strategic fence lines, but missed the subtle preparations that Mason had spent years perfecting. The irrigation channels that could be flooded on command, the carefully maintained lines of sight, the hidden paths that allowed defenders to move unseen between positions. Another lightning flash, and Rachel caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. One of the attackers carried dynamite, the fuses protected from the rain by an oilskin wrap. They weren't just testing defenses. They were planning to breach them. Before she could warn her father, the night erupted into chaos. The gang had triggered one of Mason's early warning systems, a hidden tripwire that sent dozens of tin cans clattering through the darkness. The noise spooked their horses, destroying any hope of a coordinated attack. What happened next seemed to defy natural law. Mason Wells emerged from the shadows like his old ghost namesake, moving with a speed and precision that made Rachel's breath catch. The first attacker never saw what hit him. One moment he was raising his rifle, the next he was disarmed and unconscious. The second man managed to fire, but the shot went wild as Mason seemed to flow around it like water. The Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, its rapport lost in a thunderclap as it sent the man's weapon spinning away. "That's far enough, boys," Mason's voice cut through the storm. "Next shot won't be so gentle." 3 more attackers broke cover trying to flank him, but they'd forgotten about Rachel. Her sharps barked twice, the rounds striking the ground at their feet with surgical precision. The men froze, suddenly realizing they were caught in a crossfire. "Your boss is watching," Mason continued, his tone almost conversational. "Probably got those fancy new rifles trained on us right now. But he won't help you. Men like Harrison, they consider folks like you expendable." Lightning illuminated the scene, revealing the remaining attackers caught in various positions of vulnerability. One still clutched the dynamite, his hands shaking, as he realized how close the lightning was striking. "Might want to put that down, son," Mason advised. "Storm like this, metal caps have a way of attracting nature's attention." The man fumbled with the explosives, nearly dropping them before managing to lay them carefully in the mud. As if to emphasize Mason's warning, lightning struck a tree on the ridge where Harrison's observers were positioned. The flash revealed several figures hastily abandoning their posts. Rachel maintained her cover on the group, while her father systematically disarmed them. His movements were efficient, almost gentle, but carried an authority that prevented any resistance. These weren't hardened killers like Harrison's men. They were local tough guys who'd never faced someone with real combat experience. "Evening's got 2 possible endings," Mason announced to the captured men. "You can ride out of here, spread the word that this farm's more trouble than it's worth. Or you can keep pushing, find out why they used to call me a ghost." His voice dropped lower. "Your choice, but consider this. I already know each of your names, your families, where you bed down at night. Had 10 years to learn this territory, the same as I learned every face in it." The threat, delivered with calm certainty, hit harder than any violence could have. These men had grown up hearing stories about the war, about soldiers who could kill without being seen. Now they were facing one, and the reality was far more terrifying than the legends. One of the attackers, barely more than a boy, broke first. "Mr. Wells, sir, we didn't know. Blackwood said it was just going to be a warning, scare you into selling. Didn't say anything about who you really were." Mason's response carried clearly through the rain. "Now you know. Question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" The storm's fury was fading, moving east toward the territories. In its wake, 10 men who'd arrived as attackers departed as unwitting messengers. Their story would spread through every saloon and camp in the region. The tale of how Mason Wells had disarmed and humbled them without firing a single fatal shot. Rachel descended from her position once the riders were gone, finding her father examining the abandoned dynamite. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Harrison won't give up just because his first probe failed." "No," Mason agreed, his voice thoughtful, "but he learned something he didn't expect." He held up one of the sticks of dynamite, studying its construction. "This isn't local stock. Army supply markings, latest manufacture. Harrison's getting support from someone high up in the military chain." The implications were clear. This wasn't just about water rights or railroad land grabs anymore. The corruption Sarah Montgomery had uncovered went deeper than anyone had suspected. As they secured the farm for what remained of the night, Rachel noticed something had changed in her father's demeanor. The careful mask of the simple farmer had fallen away, revealing glimpses of the man he'd been during the war. His movements were more fluid, his awareness sharper, as if old instincts were awakening after years of dormancy. "You let them see," she realized. "You wanted witnesses to what you can do." Mason nodded, checking the priming on his Colt before holstering it. Harrison's too smart to fall for simple intimidation. But his men, Blackwood's boys, they're different. Fear spreads through men like that, making them hesitate at crucial moments. A rifle shot cracked through the pre-dawn silence, the bullet striking the water trough with surgical precision. Message received. Harrison was letting them know that his trained killers were still out there, watching and waiting. "He's angry," Rachel observed, noting how her father seemed almost satisfied by the shot's placement. More than that, he's starting to worry. Mason's smile held echoes of his ghostly past. Men like Harrison, they're dangerous because they plan everything, control every detail, but now he knows he's not the only one who's been preparing for this fight. As the sun began to rise, more riders appeared on the distant ridges. Not Harrison's men this time, but local farmers and ranchers. Word of the night's events had spread faster than even Mason had anticipated. They came seeking not just protection, but leadership. Rachel watched her father greet them, noting how naturally he fell into the role of commander. These weren't soldiers, but they were men and women who understood that sometimes fighting for justice meant standing together against those who would take everything through force and fear. The ghost of Petersburg was awakening, not as a killer, this time, but as something more powerful, a symbol of resistance against the corruption that threatened to strangle the territory's future. And as Rachel studied the determination in her father's eyes, she understood that Harrison's greatest mistake hadn't been threatening their farm. It had been forcing Mason Wells to remember exactly who he was and why a legend of the war had chosen to become a farmer in the first place. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the fastest gun or the strongest arm. It's the patient calculation of a man who knows that true victory comes from making your enemies defeat themselves. Dawn painted the sky in shades of promise and warning as Mason Wells began organizing the community's defense. Harrison had military training and political connections on his side, but he'd forgotten the most important lesson of the war. A ghost might fade away, but it never truly dies. And now, the spirit of justice that had haunted Petersburg was rising. Again, wrapped not in the shadows of war, but in the simple strength of a father protecting not just his family, but an entire community's future. The morning brought another unexpected visitor. Thomas Gray, the telegraph operator from town, arrived breathless on a lathered horse. His normally pristine vest was stained with trail dust, and his wire-rimmed spectacles sat crooked on his nose. "Mr. Wells," he called out, even before his horse fully stopped. "Had to warn you. Messages coming through all morning. Military supply trains rerouted, troop movements cancelled. Someone's clearing the board." Mason helped the younger man dismount. "Harrison's influence reaches further than we thought. That's not all." Gray produced several telegraph transcripts from his satchel. "These came through encrypted, but I recognize the pattern. Same one used during the war for special operations communications." Rachel watched her father study the papers, noting how his expression hardened. "They're coordinating something bigger," she said. "More than that." Mason handed her the transcripts. "They're using the old ghost unit codes. Harrison's not just planning an attack, he's trying to recreate our old hunting grounds." The implications were chilling. During the war, both sides had employed shadow units for operations that could never be officially acknowledged. The ghost unit's tactics had been legendary, not just for their effectiveness, but for the psychological impact they had on enemy forces. One of the local ranchers, Bill Henderson, approached with his son Jimmy. The boy carried something wrapped in an oilcloth. "Found this by our North Creek," Henderson said. "Jimmy recognized it from your descriptions." Mason unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a brass and steel device that gleamed dully in the morning light. "British-made rangefinder," he explained to Rachel. "Harrison's men are mapping every approach, every firing position." "But why leave it?" Jimmy asked. "Seems careless for professional soldiers." Mason's smile held no warmth. "Because they wanted us to find it, telling us they can hit us from any distance, any angle." He hefted the device thoughtfully. "But they made a mistake. This model was used by my unit during the war. I know its weaknesses." Throughout the morning, more farmers arrived, with similar reports. Harrison's men had been spotted taking measurements, marking positions, establishing a web of surveillance that surrounded not just the Wells farm, but much of the surrounding territory. Rachel coordinated the reports, while Mason taught the gathered men and women basic defensive tactics. These weren't soldiers, but they were people who understood the land, who knew every hidden trail and water source. "Harrison's thinking like a military commander," Mason explained to the group, "expecting us to defend fixed positions, to react the way soldiers would. But we're not fighting a war, we're protecting our homes." He demonstrated techniques for moving unseen through familiar terrain, for using natural features as cover, for communicating without being detected. The same skills that had made him a legend during the war now served a different purpose: teaching others to defend what was theirs. By midday, the gathering had transformed into something Harrison couldn't have anticipated. The Wells farm had become a center of resistance, not through military force, but through the shared determination of people who refused to be driven from their land. A shot rang out from the distant ridge, another message from Harrison's observers. But this time, the response wasn't fear. The assembled farmers merely adjusted their positions, using the techniques Mason had shown them to find better cover. "See how they're shooting?" Mason asked Rachel as they watched the community organize. "Regular intervals, precise distances, military discipline." He checked his pocket watch. "They'll maintain this pattern until sunset, trying to wear us down. While their real forces move into position," Rachel added, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Exactly. Harrison always favored complex strategies, layers of deception. Makes him predictable, if you know how he thinks." A rider approached from the east, and Mason's hand moved to his Colt before recognizing Marcus Lynch's distinctive silhouette. The tracker dismounted among the gathered defenders, his mismatched eyes taking in the scene with professional appreciation. "Quite an army. You're building, Ghost," Lynch observed quietly. "Not an army," Mason corrected. "A community." Lynch nodded toward the ridgeline, where Harrison's men maintained their watch. "They're pulling back, consolidating their positions. Something's changed in their planning. They've realized we're not following their script." Mason studied the distant positions through his spyglass. "Harrison's used to controlling every aspect of an operation. Now he's facing an enemy that won't behave predictably." The tracker produced a worn map, marking positions with precise dots. "Main force is gathering here in Thunder Canyon, 50 men heavily armed, but that's not what should worry you." He pointed to several smaller marks. "These are different, moving in pairs, staying hidden, elite teams like the ones you used to lead." Rachel examined the map, noting how the marked positions formed a pattern. "They're not just surrounding us. They're creating corridors, trying to channel our movements." "Smart girl," Lynch approved. "Just like her mother. Sarah would be proud." As afternoon faded toward evening, Mason gathered the community leaders in the barn. The space had been transformed into a command center with maps and diagrams covering the walls. Each person had their role, their area of responsibility. "Harrison's men will come tonight," Mason announced. "Not the main force, that's for tomorrow. Tonight they'll send their best, their ghost hunters. They'll expect us to be tired, watching the obvious approaches." Bill Henderson spoke up. "We're ready, Mason, just tell us what you need." Mason's response was interrupted by a series of shots from the ridge, not the regular pattern of before, but a new rhythm that made him stiffen. Rachel recognized it too. Military signals, using the ghost unit's old codes. "What are they saying?" someone asked. Mason's expression was grim. "They're calling me out, challenging the ghost to prove he still exists." He checked his Colt with practiced efficiency. "Harrison's forcing my hand, trying to make me respond the way I would have during the war." The gathered defenders watched as Mason Wells seemed to transform before their eyes. The simple farmer's demeanor fell away completely, revealing the deadly grace of a man who had once been legendary. But there was something else there too, a patience, a wisdom that the ghost of Petersburg had never possessed. "Tonight," he told them, "you'll see why they feared the ghost. But more importantly, you'll learn why that fear was never what mattered most." He turned to Rachel, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had made her mother legendary. In her own right, they think they're hunting a shadow from the past. Time to show them what a ghost becomes when he has something real to protect. Night descended on the Wells farm like a velvet shroud, bringing with it a darkness deeper than natural. The clouds that had threatened all afternoon finally unleashed their fury, turning the grounds into a treacherous maze of mud and shadow. Perfect conditions for what was to come. Mason moved through the rain like a ghost of old, checking positions. One final time, the local defenders had been sent home. This night's work required a different kind of skill. Only Rachel remained, manning her position in the barn's concealed lookout, though her father had tried to convince her to leave. "They'll expect me to be alone," he'd explained earlier. "Harrison knows how I used to operate." "Then let's show him how we operate now," was her response, her mother's determination shining in her eyes. The first sign came just after midnight, a subtle change in the cricket sounds to the east. Mason smiled grimly. Harrison's men were good, using nature's rhythms to mask their approach, but they didn't know this land like he did. Every creature, every sound had become familiar over 10 years of patient observation. A flash of lightning revealed shadows moving through the rain, not the clumsy advance of Blackwood's men this time, but the precise coordination of trained killers. They moved in pairs, each team covering the other's approach, using techniques that Mason himself had helped develop during the war. Rachel's voice whispered through the speaking tube, 6 pairs, classic ghost unit formation. "Harrison's testing us," Mason replied softly, "seeing if we remember the old ways." The attackers reached their first objective, securing the outer barn without raising an alarm. Their movements were perfect, their timing flawless. They were executing the same kind of raid that had made the ghost unit legendary, but Mason Wells hadn't spent 10 years farming this land without making some modifications to the classic playbook. The first team to enter the barn triggered a mechanism that neither military training nor tactical genius could have anticipated. A series of carefully balanced hay bales, rigged with Mason's own innovation, created a cascading collapse that forced the intruders to dive for cover. In that moment of confusion, the true trap was sprung. Mason's voice carried through the darkness, seemingly from everywhere at once. Another trick he'd perfected using the barn's acoustics. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to my home." The raiders tried to maintain formation, but something was wrong. The barn's interior, which had appeared normal during their surveillance, had been subtly altered. Shadows didn't fall where they should, distances seemed to shift, and every defensive position they'd planned to use had been rendered useless. "Harrison trained you well," Mason continued, his voice moving impossibly through the space. "But he taught you to fight soldiers. I learned to hunt ghosts." A shot rang out, one of the raiders firing at a moving shadow. The bullet struck wood, and in the muzzle flash, the man caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. The barn's walls were lined with mirrors, carefully angled and concealed. Every movement they made was visible from multiple angles. Rachel's voice joined her father's, using the same acoustic tricks. "You have one chance to withdraw. After that, we stop playing nice." The threat might have seemed empty coming from a farmer's daughter, but these men had studied the ghost unit's history. They knew about Sarah Montgomery, about how she'd turned psychological warfare into an art form. Now her daughter was using those same techniques, and the raiders found themselves facing echoes of legends they'd thought long dead. Outside, the other teams maintained their positions, waiting for signals from the barn team that would never come. The rain intensified, and with it came new sounds, movement in the darkness that seemed to defy natural law. Mason Wells emerged from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, his movements flowing like water between raindrops. The first pair of raiders never saw him coming. One moment they were covering the north approach, the next they were disarmed and unconscious. Their weapons disappeared into the night. The second team managed to fire, but their shots passed through empty air. Mason's response was swift and precise, not killing blows, but the kind of calculated strikes that left men unable to continue the fight. Inside the barn, Rachel proved that her father's training had gone far beyond simple marksmanship. Using the mirror system and her knowledge of the structure's design, she created the illusion of multiple defenders moving through the shadows. The raiders, despite their training, found themselves caught in a web of deception that turned their own tactical doctrine against them. A signal flare burst above the farm, Harrison ordering his men to withdraw. But retreat had been part of Mason's calculations. The raiders found their carefully planned escape routes blocked or altered, forcing them to move exactly where he wanted them. One by one, the elite teams fell to techniques they thought they understood. Mason didn't just defeat them. He systematically dismantled their confidence, their belief in the tactical superiority that Harrison had instilled. The last pair of raiders made it furthest, almost reaching their designated rally. Point before, Mason's voice emerged from the darkness behind them. "Harrison won't be pleased," he said quietly. "Elite teams, trained in ghost tactics, defeated by a farmer and his daughter." One of the men, desperate to overcome training, swung around with his knife. Mason's movement was almost gentle as he disarmed him, the blade disappearing into the rain. "You have a choice," Mason continued. "Return to Harrison, admit failure, wait for his punishment, or—" He let the word hang in the air. "Or what?" the second man demanded. "Or remember that. Loyalty, like fear, works both ways. Harrison's planning something bigger than this raid, something that will destroy more than just my farm." The raiders exchanged glances, years of conditioning and warring with the night's harsh lessons. Finally, the knife wielder spoke. "The railroad. Commission meeting. 3 days from now. Harrison's men are placed throughout the territory, ready to move when he gives the signal." His partners started to object, but Mason's voice cut through the darkness. "You're doing the right thing. Harrison's vision of the future leaves no room for men like you, just pawns to be sacrificed when convenient." Dawn approached as Mason and Rachel secured their prisoners and collected the scattered weapons. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a landscape transformed by mud and shadow. But something else had changed too. The balance of power had shifted in ways that Harrison's military mind might not yet comprehend. Rachel found her father examining one of the captured rifles, his expression thoughtful. "They'll tell him everything," she said, "about the mirrors, the acoustic tricks, all of it. Count on it." Mason's smile held no humor. "But that's not what will worry him most. These men were his elite, trained to fight the way I used to. Now, they've seen something different. A way of fighting that uses the enemy's strength against them." The sun rose over the Wells farm, revealing the night's work to the gathering light. 12 of Harrison's best men had been systematically defeated, not by superior force or military tactics, but by a deeper understanding of how to turn fear itself into a weapon. But as Rachel helped her father prepare for what would come next, she noticed something in his manner that spoke of concerns beyond the immediate victory. "What is it?" she asked. Mason gestured toward the distant ridges where Harrison's observers would soon resume their watch. This was too easy. Harrison's too smart to commit his best men without a deeper purpose. He checked his colt, more from habit than necessity. He wanted us to defeat them, wanted to see how we'd do it. Why? Because now he knows we're thinking like ghosts again, using deception, psychology, turning his tactics against him. Mason's expression hardened, and that's exactly what he wanted. Because the real threat isn't coming from the shadows anymore. It's coming in broad daylight, wearing badges and carrying papers signed by territorial judges. Rachel understood then that the night's victory, impressive as it was, had been a part of a larger game. Harrison had sacrificed pieces to gain information, to force them to reveal capabilities that he could now plan against. The ghost of Petersburg had emerged to protect his home, but in doing so, he'd shown his hand to an enemy who specialized in turning revelations into vulnerabilities. The coming battle wouldn't be fought with rifles and tactical raids. It would be contested in courtrooms and council chambers with water rights and railroad contracts as the weapons. But Mason Wells hadn't spent 10 years building a peaceful life just to lose it to political maneuvering. The skills that had made him legendary during the war had evolved, adapted to a different kind of conflict. And as he watched Harrison's observers return to their posts, he allowed himself a grim smile. Because sometimes the most effective ghost isn't the one that strikes from shadows, but the one that stands in plain sight, forcing enemies to destroy themselves through their own paranoid calculations. As the morning progressed, Mason and Rachel began discovering other elements of Harrison's strategy. Among the raiders' equipment, they found detailed maps marked with locations that went far beyond their farm. Railroad junctions, water sources, telegraph offices, even Indian tribal gathering places. He's mapping the entire territory's pressure. "A point," Rachel observed, spreading the documents across their kitchen table. "Every place where control could be established or resistance might emerge." Mason studied a particular notation that caught his eye. "Look at these markings: army supply routes, patrol schedules. Harrison's not just planning to control the own territory. He's preparing to isolate it completely." Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Gray, the telegraph operator. The young man's face was flushed with urgency. "More encrypted messages," he reported, handing over several transcripts. "But there's something else. The Railroad Commission's schedule has been changed. Meeting's been moved up to tomorrow." Mason's expression remained neutral, but Rachel saw the subtle tension in his shoulders. Harrison's accelerating his timeline. Last night's raid wasn't just about us. It was a rehearsal for something bigger. Gray nodded nervously. "There's more. Military patrols around Fort Laramie are being redirected. Official reason is Indian activity, but the activity is being staged," Mason finished. "Harrison's men creating just enough trouble to justify moving troops away from where they'll really be needed." Rachel examined the map again, seeing the pattern emerge. The commission meeting, the troop movements, the territorial surveys, they're all connected. Harrison's not just trying to take our farm. He's orchestrating a complete takeover of the region's infrastructure. Mason began cleaning his colt, his movements precise and thoughtful. Using legal means to establish control, backed by the threat of force. Classic military strategy: secure key positions before the enemy realizes they're threatened. A shot rang out from the ridge, another message from Harrison's observers. But this time, The pattern was different. Rachel decoded it quickly, her expression darkening. "He's offering terms," she translated. "Says we've proven our point, shown we can still fight. Now he's willing to negotiate a mutually beneficial arrangement." Mason's laugh held no humor. "He's not offering terms. He's trying to confirm his suspicions about last night." He moved to the window, studying the distant positions through his spyglass. "Harrison knows those raiders will talk. Tell him about our preparations. He wants to see how we respond to an apparent olive branch." The day brought more visitors. Local farmers reporting strange activities throughout the territory. Cattle stampedes driving herds away from water sources, mysterious fires at key storage facilities, telegraph lines suddenly requiring maintenance that left communities isolated. "It's already starting," Mason explained to Rachel as they logged each report. "Harrison's creating chaos, making people desperate for the kind of protection he plans to offer through official channels." Their discussion was interrupted by the approach of a single rider, Marcus Lynch, appearing as always like a ghost himself. The tracker dismounted with his characteristic grace, but something in his manner suggested urgency. "Harrison's men are moving," he reported without preamble. "Not just the observers or raiders. His entire force is mobilizing, breaking camp at Thunder Canyon." Mason's eyes narrowed. "The commission meeting's tomorrow. He shouldn't be moving his main force yet." "Unless—" "That's not his real target," Rachel suggested. "The meeting's just cover for something else." Lynch produced a crumpled paper, a partial copy of a military order. "Found this in one of their abandoned positions. Mentioned something called Operation Kingmaker." Mason studied the document, his expression hardening. During the war, Kingmaker was a code name for operations designed to completely reshape territorial control. Not just military victories, total restructuring of political and economic power. The implications were staggering. Harrison wasn't just planning to take control of water rights or railroad contracts. He was implementing a strategy that would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the entire territory. As evening approached, more signals came from Harrison's observers, complex patterns that Mason recognized from his Ghost Unit days. Each message seemed to offer different terms, different opportunities for negotiation. "He's fishing," Mason explained to Rachel. "Each offer contains specific details that only certain people would know. He's trying to identify our sources, understand how much we've learned about his operation." Rachel watched her father compose responses, using the same codes, but subtly altering key elements. "We're feeding him false confirmations," she realized, "making him think his suspicions about our knowledge are correct. Harrison's greatest weakness is his need to control every variable," Mason confirmed. "Right now, he thinks he's manipulating us into revealing our sources. Instead, we're manipulating what he thinks we know." Rachel smiled, her mother's strategic brilliance shining through, making him adjust his plans to counter threats that don't exist. The sun began to set, painting the territory in shades of gold and shadow. Mason Wells stood on his porch, watching Harrison's observers maintain their positions despite the growing darkness. The night's raid had confirmed what he'd suspected. Their enemy was implementing a plan years in the making, using the railroad's expansion as cover for a complete takeover of the territory. But Harrison had made a crucial mistake. In forcing the ghost of Petersburg to emerge, he'd awakened not just a legendary fighter, but a man who understood that true power came from controlling what your enemy believed. The coming battle wouldn't be won through force of arms or tactical brilliance, but through the careful manipulation of fear, assumption, and desire. "Your mother used to say something," Mason told Rachel as they prepared for whatever the night might bring. "Said the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you can see, but the one you think you understand." Rachel checked her rifle, her movements reflecting years of patient training. Harrison thinks he understands the ghost, thinks he knows how you'll react. Exactly. Mason's smile held echoes of past victories and future promises. And that's why when the time comes, he'll never see the real threat until it's too late. The territory stretched out before them, a landscape of opportunity and danger that Harrison sought to control through force and fear. But as darkness fell over the Wells farm, father and daughter prepared to show their enemies that some battles are won not by the strongest or the most clever, but by those who understand that true power lies in making your opponents defeat themselves. The pre-dawn hours brought an unexpected arrival to the Wells farm. Sheriff Patterson's deputy, young Michael Turner, rode in hard, his horse lathered, despite the cool morning air. His news confirmed Mason's worst suspicions about Harrison's expanding influence. "Judge Carlton's been arrested," Turner reported, his voice tight with urgency. "Federal marshals took him in the middle of the night. Charges of corruption, conspiracy with Indian traders." Mason's expression remained carefully neutral, but Rachel caught the significance immediately. Carlton was the only territorial judge who couldn't be bought, whose commitment to justice had made him a natural ally against Harrison's plans. "Convenient timing," Mason observed, offering Turner coffee. "Day before the Railroad Commission meeting." The deputy nodded grimly. "That's not all. Banks froze most local accounts, claiming orders from the territorial governor. People can't access their savings, can't pay for supplies. Town's about to explode." Rachel spread out their map of the territory, marking the latest developments. A pattern emerged. Each new crisis seemed designed to create maximum disruption while appearing, completely unrelated to Harrison's operations. "He's orchestrating chaos," she realized, "making people desperate for any solution, any authority that promises to restore order." Mason studied the map thoughtfully. "And tomorrow, when the commission meets, Harrison's people will present exactly that solution. Complete reorganization of water rights, railroad access, everything needed to control the territory's future." Turner shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff sent me to warn you. Harrison's men have been asking questions about your past." "About Richmond." "Expected that," Mason replied. "Man like Harrison won't just attack physically. He'll try to destroy reputations first, make any resistance seem suspicious." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Lynch, materializing from the morning mist like a spirit. The tracker's expression was grave as he handed Mason a folder of documents. "Found these in a camp. Harrison's men abandoned," Lynch reported. "Military contracts, land grant proposals, even pardons waiting to be signed. He's been planning this for years." Mason examined the papers carefully. "These are originals, not copies, official seals, proper signatures. Harrison has supporters at the highest levels." "More than supporters," Lynch added. "Partners, men who stand to make fortunes once the territory's under their control." Rachel noticed something else in the documents, a list of names, dates, and locations. "These are witnesses," she said quietly. "People who could expose the conspiracy." Mason's expression hardened as he recognized several names. "And they're being systematically eliminated. Judge Carlton's arrest is just the beginning." The morning progressed with a steady stream of visitors. Farmers reporting suspicious activities, merchants worried about frozen accounts, even tribal representatives warning of increased military presence near their lands. Each piece of information added to the complex web of Harrison's strategy. In the barn, Mason and Rachel began organizing their own countermoves. The night's successful defense had bought them time, but Harrison's true assault would come through legal and economic channels. "We need to understand exactly what he's planning," Mason explained to their gathered allies. "Not just the commission meeting, but his entire operation." Thomas Gray, the telegraph operator, arrived with fresh transcripts. Messages are getting more frequent, using multiple codes. They're coordinating something big. Rachel decoded the transmissions, while Mason studied patrol patterns through his spyglass. Harrison's observers had changed their positions, adopting a new formation that suggested more than simple surveillance. They're setting up a cordon, Mason realized. Not to keep us in, but to control what information reaches the commission meeting. Lynch materialized from his latest scouting run, found more abandoned camps. They're consolidating forces, moving everything toward town, but something's wrong with the pattern. Mason examined the tracker's detailed maps. They're leaving gaps in their coverage, obvious routes that any military commander would secure. Almost like they want certain people to slip through, Rachel added, understanding dawning in her eyes. Exactly. Mason's smile held no warmth. Harrison's not just planning to control the commission meeting, he's orchestrating a complete takeover of the territory's power structure. The meeting is just the trigger. Deputy Turner, who had stayed to help, looked confused. But how does letting people through his lines help him? Because he wants witnesses, Mason explained. People who'll see exactly what he wants them to see. When the takeover happens, it needs to look legitimate, like a necessary response to a crisis. The implications became clear as they pieced together more intelligence. Harrison wasn't just planning to seize control. He was arranging for carefully selected witnesses to observe what would appear to be a legal transfer of power. Rachel studied the documents Lynch had recovered. These pardons, the contracts, they're not just rewards for his allies. They're insurance. Once these are signed, everything becomes official. No one will be able to challenge his authority without challenging the territorial government itself. Mason began writing a series of letters, each encoded differently. Time to call in some old debts, he explained to Rachel. Your mother didn't just gather intelligence during the war. She built networks, connections that survived long after the fighting ended. Throughout the day, riders departed the wells, farm carrying Mason's messages. Each took a different route, used different signals to avoid Harrison's observers. They were activating a web of allies that Sarah Montgomery had cultivated years ago. Harrison thinks he's the only one who can play a long game, Mason told Rachel as they watched the last rider disappear into the afternoon heat. But your mother understood something he never did. True power isn't about controlling territory. It's about knowing who to trust when everything falls apart. As evening approached, more signals came from Harrison's observers. But now, Mason understood their real purpose. The coded messages weren't just communications. They were pieces of a larger deception, meant to convince anyone watching that Harrison's operation was smaller than it actually was. He's hiding his true strength, Rachel observed, making us think tomorrow is just about the commission meeting. Because the meeting is just the beginning, Mason agreed. Once he has control of the water rights, everything else falls into place. Railroad contracts, military supplies, even Indian treaties, all will be renegotiated under his authority. Lynch appeared silently beside them, his mismatched eyes scanning the horizon. Towns filling up, merchants, bankers, tribal leaders, everyone with a stake in tomorrow's decision. But Harrison's men are positioning themselves carefully, controlling who talks to whom. Mason nodded grimly. He's isolating potential opposition, making sure no one realizes how many others share their concerns. He checked his Colt out of habit. But he's forgotten something important about ghosts. What's that? Rachel asked. Sometimes they don't have to fight at all. Sometimes just revealing the truth is enough to destroy the most carefully planned operation. As night fell over the territory, Mason Wells put the finishing touches on their counter-strategy. Harrison had spent years building his web of power, using military precision to arrange every detail. But he'd made a crucial mistake, one that Sarah Montgomery would have recognized immediately. He'd assumed that the ghost of Petersburg was just a killer, a tactical genius who could be countered with proper strategy. But Mason Wells had become something more during his years of peaceful farming. He'd learned that true victory sometimes came not from fighting your enemies, but from showing them that their own plans would lead to their destruction. Tomorrow's commission meeting wouldn't just decide the fate of water rights or railroad contracts. It would determine whether the territory would be controlled by men like Harrison, who saw power as something to be seized, or by communities who understood that true strength came from standing together against those who would rule through fear and manipulation. The ghost of Petersburg was about to teach his enemies one final lesson, that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a legal document, but the simple truth revealed at exactly the right moment. The night brought another unexpected visitor. William Hawthorne, the elderly clerk from the Territorial Land Office, arrived under cover of darkness. His frail appearance belied the sharp mind that had served the territory for 3 decades. "They're rewriting history," Hawthorne announced, producing a stack of documents. Land grants, water rights, property boundaries, all being quietly altered. Small changes, dates shifted, names modified, building a paper trail that will look legitimate under official scrutiny. Mason examined the documents while Rachel prepared coffee for their visitor. "How long has this been happening?" "Months, maybe longer." Hawthorne's hands shook slightly as he accepted the coffee. Didn't see the pattern at first. Each change seemed minor, clerical corrections. But together, he spread out several maps showing the territory's evolution. They're creating a narrative that supports Harrison's claims to authority. Lynch, who had been listening silently from the shadows, moved forward to study the alterations. Clever. They're not just changing current records, they're modifying the history of how the territory developed. Rachel saw it too, making it look like certain rights and authorities were always in place, so when Harrison exercises them, it'll appear completely legal, Mason finished. Anyone challenging him would have to prove decades of documents are false. Hawthorne produced one more paper, a letter bearing an official seal. "This arrived today. I'm being promoted to a new position in Washington. Train leaves tomorrow morning." "Removing witnesses," Lynch observed. "Anyone who knows the real history." Mason studied the elderly clerk thoughtfully. "How'd you get past Harrison's men?" A slight smile crossed Hawthorne's weathered face. "Been working in that office since before the war. Know every back road, every cattle trail. Some paths don't appear on any map. The information Hawthorne provided filled crucial gaps in their understanding. Harrison wasn't just planning a takeover. He was rewriting the territory's very foundations to support his authority. As they worked through the night, more pieces of Harrison's strategy became clear. The altered documents revealed connections between seemingly unrelated events, property disputes, water rights conflicts, even tribal treaties, all manipulated to create the illusion of established power structures. "Look at this," Rachel called out, comparing 2 versions of a land grant. The original shows the water rights belonging to the community. The modified version adds conditions, restrictions that Harrison's people could exploit. Mason nodded grimly. "They're not just changing who owns what. They're changing how ownership itself is defined." Lynch, examining the maps with a tracker's precision, noticed something else. These boundary changes, they're subtle, but they create choke points. Anyone wanting to move goods or cattle would have to use specific routes. Routes that Harrison's people would control, Mason confirmed. Economic strangleholds disguised as traditional trade paths. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Harrison hadn't just corrupted current officials. He'd systematically altered the territory's recorded history to support his claim to power. Deputy Turner, who had stayed to help, looked overwhelmed. "How do we fight something like this? They've thought of everything, not everything." Mason's voice held the quiet certainty that had made him legendary during the war. They're depending on complexity, on making their scheme so intricate that no one can unravel it. But complexity has a weakness. Rachel understood immediately. The more complex the deception, the more points of failure, Mason finished. Harrison's people had to involve dozens of clerks, officials, and record keepers, each one a potential witness if they had reason to talk. Hawthorne spoke up from where he'd been studying the documents. Many of those people were like me, career officials, who care about the truth. They might have been coerced into helping, but they'd turn if they saw a chance. Mason began drafting new messages, each carefully coded. Time to give them that chance. Harrison thinks tomorrow is about the Railroad Commission, about controlling water rights, but we're going to make it about something bigger. Truth, Rachel said softly, remembering her mother's writings about justice and responsibility. Exactly. Mason's smile held echoes of the ghost he'd once been. Harrison spent years building this web of lies. Tomorrow, we start pulling threads that even he doesn't know exist. As they worked, Lynch continued his silent surveillance of Harrison's positions. The observer patterns had shifted again, suggesting new preparations. They're tightening security around specific buildings in town, the tracker reported. Land, office, telegraph station, bank vault, places where records are kept. Not just security, Mason observed. They're isolating those locations, making sure no one unauthorized gets close enough to see what's happening inside. Rachel studied the pattern. They're going to alter more records during the commission meeting, use the distraction to finish changing history. The realization sparked a new element in their planning. Harrison's scheme didn't just depend on controlling the commission's decision. It required maintaining the illusion that his authority had always existed. Your mother understood this kind of fight, Mason told Rachel as they refined their strategy. She knew that some battles aren't won with guns or armies, but with knowledge and truth. The first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky as they finalized their preparations. Harrison had spent years building his operation, creating layers of deception that would seem unassailable. But he'd made a critical mistake, one that Sarah Montgomery would have recognized immediately. He'd assumed that power came from controlling information, from building a narrative so complex that no one could challenge it. But Mason Wells had learned something different during his years of farming. He'd discovered that true strength often came from simplicity, from fundamental truths that no amount of clever paperwork could erase. As the sun rose over the territory, the ghost of Petersburg prepared to demonstrate that lesson one final time. Harrison's carefully constructed web of power was about to encounter something far more dangerous than military force or tactical brilliance, the simple truth, revealed by people who understood that justice wasn't just about following laws, but about protecting the very foundations of community and trust. Dawn painted the town of Salvation Creek in shades of amber and shadow as Mason Wells and Rachel made their final preparations. The Railroad Commission meeting was hours away, but Harrison's influence already hung over the streets like a gathering storm. Armed men patrolled in pairs, their military bearing marking them as more than simple security. Mason noticed how shopkeepers avoided eye contact, how mothers hurried their children indoors, how every conversation seemed to die when Harrison's men passed. Fear was taking root, exactly as planned. Just like Petersburg, he murmured, adjusting his gun belt beneath the simple farmer's coat. Control the mood before controlling the territory. Rachel, walking beside him, caught the shadow that crossed his face. You've seen this before. Your mother saw it first. Mason's voice softened at the memory. Sarah always said occupation starts in people's minds, long before it reaches their homes. Their early morning reconnaissance was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected figure, Elizabeth Carlton, the arrested judge's wife. Her normally pristine appearance showed signs of strain. but her bearing remained proud as she approached. They took everything, she reported quietly, falling into step beside them. Not just James's files, personal papers, letters, even photographs. They're erasing him, piece by piece. Mason guided them toward the alley behind the general store, away from watching eyes. What kind of letters? Correspondence about Harrison. From before the war. James knew him then, knew what he was capable of. Elizabeth's voice caught slightly. But that's not why I'm here. They found something else while searching our house. A letter from Sarah. Rachel felt her father tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. When? Just before she died, Elizabeth produced a weathered envelope from her sleeve. James kept it safe all these years, knowing what it could mean. Harrison's men didn't find this one. Mason accepted the letter with careful hands, recognizing his wife's precise handwriting. The date marked it as written just days before the childbirth that would take her life. She knew, Elizabeth continued softly, about Harrison's plans, about the networks he was building. She'd been tracking it all, even while carrying Rachel. The letter contains names, dates, connections, everything needed to expose what he's really doing here. The implications were staggering. Sarah Montgomery hadn't just been gathering intelligence during her final months. She'd been creating a record that could destroy Harrison's entire operation. But as Mason read the letter, his expression grew darker. This is why they arrested James. Not just to control the legal system, but because they knew he had this information. There's more, Elizabeth added. Harrison's men have been asking questions around town about Sarah, about her work during the war. They're planning to use her reputation against you, Rachel understood immediately. They'll claim she was a double agent, that her intelligence work was compromised. Make any evidence she gathered seem suspicious. Mason carefully folded the letter, his movements precise, but his eyes holding dangerous memories. Harrison's trying to destroy not just our resistance, but Sarah's entire legacy, make it impossible for anyone to trust what she discovered. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Lynch, moving like a shadow through the early morning crowds. Problem, the tracker reported tersely. Harrison's bringing in more men. Not soldiers this time, politicians, businessmen, even a federal judge. Building an audience, Mason observed, making sure the right people witness whatever he's planning. Lynch nodded grimly. But that's not all. They're clearing the old mining office, setting up some kind of display. Documents, photographs, what looks like military records. Elizabeth's face paled slightly. They're going to present evidence during the commission meeting. Things they claim prove corruption, conspiracy. A show trial, Mason finished, using the commission meeting as cover to destroy reputations, discredit anyone who might oppose them. His hand brushed the hidden letter, and Sarah's work would be at the center of it. Rachel watched the streets fill with early morning traffic, merchants opening shops, farmers bringing produce to market, all trying to maintain normalcy despite the armed men watching every move. "We can't let them do this," she said quietly. "Not just for Mother's sake, but for everyone who trusted her, who helped her gather this information." Mason's response was interrupted by commotion near the bank. Harrison's men were escorting someone, Miller, Blackwood's former lieutenant. The old cavalryman's face showed signs of rough treatment, but his bearing remained proud as they led him toward the makeshift courthouse. "They're making examples," Lynch observed. "Anyone who knows too much, who might speak against them." Mason studied the scene with tactical precision. "No, they're doing something worse. They're offering deals. Testimony in exchange for pardons, building their case with confessions from people too scared or too broken to resist." The morning progressed with the inexorable rhythm of a military operation. More wagons arrived, carrying crates of documents. Harrison's men established checkpoints at key intersections, controlling movement through the town. The Railroad Commission, Members themselves were escorted to private meetings, carefully isolated from any unauthorized contact. Elizabeth watched it all with growing concern. James tried to warn people about this, said Harrison wasn't just planning to take control. He was going to remake the entire territory in his own image, create a power structure so deeply entrenched that no one could challenge it. Using Sarah's reputation as a weapon, Rachel added bitterly, making her seem like the conspirator instead of the one who exposed the conspiracy. Mason's quiet voice cut through their dark thoughts. Your mother understood something about men like Harrison. She knew their greatest weakness isn't pride or ambition, it's their belief that fear is stronger than truth. A shot rang out from the direction of the land office, not an attack, but a signal. Harrison's observers had spotted something that required response. Within moments, armed men were moving with military precision toward the disturbance. Lynch materialized beside them, his mismatched eyes holding urgent news. They found one of our messengers, young Billy Thompson's boy. They're taking him to the mining office. Mason's expression hardened. Harrison's getting impatient, moving faster than planned. He knows we're working against him, but not how. What do we do? Rachel asked, seeing the tactical situation deteriorate. Her father's response held echoes of the ghost he'd once been. We let him think he's winning. Let him believe his show trial will destroy everything Sarah built. The dangerous smile that crossed his face would have been familiar to anyone who'd fought in Petersburg, because Harrison's forgotten the most important lesson about ghosts. What's that? Elizabeth asked. Sometimes they wait years to deliver their message, and Sarah Montgomery left one hell of a message for anyone who tried to corrupt what she died protecting. As the sun climbed higher over Salvation Creek, Mason, Wells began implementing a plan that had been waiting 10 years to unfold. Harrison thought he was orchestrating a careful takeover, using the commission meeting to establish his authority through legal means. But he'd made a crucial mistake, one that Sarah Montgomery had anticipated even before her death. He thought he was fighting a tactical battle against the ghost of Petersburg, when in reality he was facing something far more dangerous. A truth so carefully preserved that no amount of manufactured evidence could destroy it. The ghost was about to teach his enemies that some legacies can't be erased, some truths can't be buried, and some battles are won not through force or fear, but through the patient preservation of justice itself. As morning progressed, more details of Harrison's plan emerged. Thomas Gray arrived breathless from the telegraph office, having intercepted a series of coded messages that revealed the true scope of the operation. They're not just gathering witnesses, he reported, showing Mason the transcripts. They're bringing in newspaper editors, photographers, even a writer from Harper's Weekly. Harrison wants this documented, wants the territory to see what happens to those who resist progress. Rachel studied the messages while her father conferred with Lynch about security positions. Look at these names, she said suddenly. These aren't just random reporters. They're all connected to publishing houses back east, ones that specialized in discrediting Union intelligence operations during the war. Mason examined the list, his expression darkening. Harrison's been planning this longer than we thought. He's not just trying to destroy Sarah's evidence. He's trying to rewrite the entire history of wartime intelligence gathering. Elizabeth Carleton, who had remained to help, understood the implications immediately. If they can discredit the intelligence networks from the war, then everything those networks uncovered becomes suspect, Mason finished, including all the evidence of corruption and conspiracy that Sarah gathered. Their discussion was interrupted by commotion in the street. Harrison's men were escorting another prisoner, an elderly Apache scout named Two Hawks, who had worked with Sarah during the war. The old man's dignity remained intact despite his bonds, but his presence sent a clear message. "They're gathering everyone connected to your mother's intelligence work," Rachel observed, "creating a show of force that goes beyond just territorial control." Lynch materialized from his latest reconnaissance. "Found something in the mining office. They're setting up a presentation. Maps, documents, even battlefield reports. All carefully selected to tell their version of events." Mason's hand unconsciously touched the hidden letter from Sarah. "Harrison's not just planning a takeover. He's staging a performance, using the commission meeting as theater to justify everything that follows." More wagons arrived, these carrying printing equipment and photographic supplies. Harrison was ensuring that his version of events would be the one preserved for history. "There's something else," Lynch added, his voice holding unusual emotion. "They found Sarah's old field journal, the one she used during Petersburg. Harrison's men are altering it, adding entries, changing dates." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. That journal had been lost during the chaos of Sarah's final days, when complications from Rachel's birth had claimed her life. Now it would be used as a weapon against everything she'd fought to protect. Rachel saw the pain flash across her father's face, quickly masked but revealing the depth of wounds that had never fully healed. "We can't let them do this," she said, firmly. Mother's work saved lives, exposed corruption that went all the way to Washington. "It's worse than that," Elizabeth interjected. "James, Judge Carlton, he told me something before they arrested him. Sarah wasn't just gathering evidence about wartime corruption. She found connections to current operations, patterns that showed how certain people were positioning themselves to control entire territories once the railroad expanded." Mason's expression shifted subtly, showing the tactical mind that had made him legendary. That's why Harrison moved now, why he couldn't wait. The Railroad Commission isn't just about water rights. It's about establishing control before anyone can expose the larger conspiracy. A series of shots rang out from different positions around town, Harrison's men signaling changing of guard posts. But Mason noticed something in the pattern, a subtle alteration that spoke volumes. "They're nervous," he observed, "rushing. Their preparations, breaking military precision." "Harrison's worried about something," Lynch nodded in agreement. "His men are watching the wrong approaches, focusing on obvious threats while missing the subtle movements. Because Harrison thinks he knows what we'll do," Rachel realized. "He's preparing for the ghost of Petersburg, for military tactics and strategic brilliance." "But he's forgotten something crucial," Mason said softly, remembering countless conversations with Sarah about the nature of truth and justice. "Your mother's greatest weapon was never force or deception. It was her ability to make people see the truth for themselves." Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of more riders. Not Harrison's men this time, but local ranchers and farmers. They came seeking guidance, bringing reports of increased military presence throughout the territory. Mason listened to their accounts, noting how Harrison's operation extended far beyond just Salvation Creek. The Railroad Commission meeting wasn't just about controlling one town or region. It was about establishing a precedent that would allow similar takeovers throughout the expanding territories. But as he coordinated with the gathered citizens, helping them prepare for whatever might come, Mason felt something else building. Harrison had intended to use this gathering as a demonstration of power, a way to show how resistance would be crushed. Instead, he had created something else entirely. A community united not by fear, but by the shared understanding that some things were worth fighting for. Some truths had to be preserved no matter the cost. As noon approached, bringing the commission meeting ever closer, Mason Wells made final preparations to honor not just Sarah's memory, but the very principles she had died protecting. Harrison thought he was facing a tactical opponent, a ghost from the past who could be defeated through careful strategy. But he was about to learn that the most dangerous force isn't the one that fights with guns or armies, but the one that reveals truth so powerful that no amount of carefully constructed lies can stand against it. The ghost of Petersburg was about to show his enemies that some legacies transcend death itself, living on in the hearts of those who understand that justice, once awakened, cannot be buried by fear or force. The Railroad Commission meeting was set to begin at noon, but Harrison's true performance started well before the appointed hour. As morning turned to midday, Salvation Creek witnessed a carefully orchestrated display of power that transformed the simple territorial town into a stage for what was to come. Military precision marked every movement as Harrison's men escorted commission members to the converted mining office. Each commissioner was carefully isolated, surrounded by armed guards who were as much handlers as protectors. The message was clear. These proceedings would follow a very specific script. Mason and Rachel watched from the shadows of the mercantile store as wagons arrived carrying more than just documentation. Professional photographers set up their equipment, positioning cameras to capture what Harrison intended to be a historic moment. "Look at their positioning," Rachel observed quietly. "They're not just recording the event, they're creating specific angles, controlled perspectives." Mason nodded grimly. "Everything's choreographed. The armed men, the prisoners being paraded through town, even the way they're arranging the audience. Harrison's staging is more than just a takeover. He's creating a narrative that will justify everything that follows." Lynch materialized beside them, his mismatched eyes holding urgent news. "They've brought in more prisoners, not just Judge Carlton and 2 hawks. They found Peterson from the land office, Matthews from the bank, anyone who handled official documents during the past decade." The implications were clear. Harrison wasn't just securing control of current records, he was eliminating anyone who could challenge his rewriting of history. Through his spyglass, Mason studied the gathering crowd. Harrison's men had arranged the spectators carefully, positioning influential citizens where they could witness the proceedings, while keeping potential troublemakers at a careful distance. "There," Rachel pointed, noting a group of well-dressed men being escorted into prime viewing positions. Eastern investors, railroad representatives. Harrison's making sure they see exactly what he wants them to see. But something else caught Mason's attention, subtle movements among the townsfolk that suggested not everyone was following Harrison's script. Thomas Gray's telegraph operators had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd. Elizabeth Carlton's social connections had quietly spread word among the territory's most respected families. "Your mother would be proud," Mason told Rachel softly. "She always said the best way to fight corruption was to help people see it for themselves." Their observations were interrupted by the arrival of Major Harrison himself. He rode into town like a conquering general, flanked by mounted guards, and followed by a wagon carrying what appeared to be military strongboxes. "Show time," Lynch murmured, noting how Harrison's entrance had been timed perfectly with the arrival of the newspaper representatives. Mason's hand unconsciously touched the hidden letter from Sarah as he watched Harrison dismount with practiced grace. The major's uniform, though no longer officially sanctioned, gleamed with carefully maintained authority. "Citizens of Salvation Creek," Harrison's voice carried across the gathered crowd with practiced command. "Today marks a historic moment in the development of our territory. The Railroad Commission's review of water rights is more than just a legal proceeding. It represents our region's transition from frontier chaos to civilized order." Rachel noticed how Harrison's men had positioned themselves to control not just physical movement, but the flow of information itself. Anyone trying to speak against the proceedings would find themselves quickly isolated. "But before we begin," Harrison continued, his tone shifting to one of grave concern, "certain matters must be addressed. Matters concerning corruption, conspiracy, and threats to the very security of our expanding nation." At his signal, men began unloading the strongboxes, revealing carefully organized documents and photographs. Each piece of evidence was displayed with theatrical precision, creating an overwhelming impression of official authority. 10 years ago, Harrison's voice carried a subtle menace now. This territory was infiltrated by elements seeking to undermine its legitimate development. Using the chaos of war as cover, these forces established networks of corruption that persist to this day. Mason felt the crowd's reaction, the subtle shift as people began connecting Harrison's words to recent events, to the mysterious arrests and economic pressures that had plagued the territory. "We have uncovered evidence," Harrison gestured, "to the displayed documents that certain individuals used their positions during and after the war to create hidden power structures. Structures that now threaten the railroad's legitimate expansion." Rachel watched as Harrison's men began distributing printed broadsides to the crowd, carefully prepared summaries of the alleged conspiracy. But she also noticed something else, something that brought a slight smile to her face. "He's getting it wrong," she whispered to her father. "The dates, the locations, he's relying on forged documents without understanding the real history." Mason nodded almost imperceptibly. "Your mother's greatest strength wasn't just gathering intelligence. It was knowing how to preserve it in ways that couldn't be corrupted." Harrison was building to his crucial point, each word calculated for maximum impact. Among these conspirators was a woman many considered above suspicion. Sarah Montgomery, celebrated as a Union intelligence officer, was in fact responsible for creating networks of corruption that still threaten our territory's development. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. But Mason noticed something Harrison had missed, the way certain members of the crowd exchanged knowing glances. How information seemed to flow through invisible channels that the Major's men couldn't control. To demonstrate the extent of this conspiracy, Harrison signaled for another strongbox to be opened. "We have recovered Sarah Montgomery's personal journal. Its contents reveal a pattern of deception that extended far beyond military necessity." Mason's hand tightened on his concealed Colt, but Rachel's touch stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." Throughout the crowd, people were already passing notes, sharing information that contradicted Harrison's claims. Elizabeth Carlton's social network was proving more effective than military force at spreading the truth. Harrison held up the recovered journal, its pages carefully doctored to support his narrative. "This document proves beyond doubt that Sarah Montgomery used her position to establish hidden authorities, to corrupt legitimate development for her own purposes." But something was happening that Harrison's careful planning hadn't anticipated. The crowd's reaction wasn't following his script. Instead of shocked submission, there was a quiet ripple of skepticism, of shared knowledge that suggested his carefully constructed narrative was already beginning to unravel. Mason smiled slightly, seeing Sarah's true legacy at work. She hadn't just gathered evidence, she'd built relationships, connections based on trust rather than fear. Now, as Harrison tried to destroy her reputation, those connections were proving stronger than any military force. The Major continued his presentation, but there was a new edge to his voice, a hint of uncertainty as he realized his audience wasn't responding as planned. His men shifted nervously, sensing the change in atmosphere, but unable to identify its source. "The Railroad Commission," Harrison pressed on, "must consider these revelations when reviewing water rights and development proposals. The security of our territory depends on rooting out this corruption, on establishing proper authority over—" His words were interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the crowd. Two Hawks, the elderly Apache scout, had somehow slipped his bonds. But instead of trying to escape, he stood calmly, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered citizens. "I knew Sarah Montgomery," the old warrior announced. "Knew her heart, her truth. The words in that journal, he pointed at Harrison's evidence, they speak with a forked tongue. Harrison's men moved to seize 2 hawks, but something stopped them. The crowd had shifted, creating a space around the Apache scout that would force any intervention to be publicly violent. Mason watched as Harrison's careful choreography began to falter. The Major hadn't just underestimated the strength of Sarah's connections. He'd failed to understand that true authority came from trust, not force. The confrontation was building to a crucial moment, but not in the way Harrison had planned. His theatrical display of power was being transformed into something else entirely, a revelation not of conspiracy, but of how truth, properly preserved, could overcome even the most carefully constructed deception. The Ghost of Petersburg was about to demonstrate that some battles are won not through force of arms or tactical brilliance, but through the patient cultivation of justice itself. Harrison had brought military precision and political power to this fight, but he was about to learn that the strongest weapons aren't always the most obvious ones. Harrison's face darkened as 2 hawks' words rippled through the crowd. The Major raised his hand, signaling his men to restore order, but another voice rang out, this one from the opposite side of the gathering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.